First of all, I want to thank everybody here for sticking around.
Thank you. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, we have a treat at the very end of our presentation. Cecilia Muñoz, who's the director of the White House Domestic Policy Council under President Obama. So she's about to finally catch up on what, 8 years of sleep? Or so I'm going to start out asking the question that I'm guessing everybody must have on their mind. You're about to hand over the reins of your education legacy to Donald Trump and his team. How nervous are you that they are going to reverse all of the initiatives that you've built over the past 8 years?
So first of all, I apologize profusely for being late.
Oh, no.
Just to let you know, it's a parking lot out there, just to be forewarned. So as the president has said, it's incredibly important that we honor the process of a smooth transition. We benefited. When I was part of the transition, I actually started the day after the President Obama's inauguration. We benefited tremendously from the fact that the Bush administration did a generous and thoughtful and professional job at handing over the reins, and we're doing the same thing. It's a hallmark of our democracy, and we're really actually very proud of that. And on the set of education issues, of which we are incredibly proud of the accomplishments, look, I think there are incredibly important benchmarks that are not controversial, that are not the subject really of partisan wrangling. In fact, we passed bipartisan legislation on education reform a year ago. And we expect to be held accountable by the American people on the kinds of indicators that we've been talking about, like what happens to the graduation rate. It has been going up. What happens to the lowest performing schools? The number of dropout factories has dropped in half. So the trend lines are moving in a good direction, and ultimately that is something that the American people support, and that's something that players on both sides of the aisle are interested in achieving. So at the end of the day, I think that those measures are clear. And the American people have a right to expect of any administration that they move the trend lines in the right direction. And we certainly hope that our successors will be successful in moving those trend lines in the right direction, because that's why we're here. That's the point of running an education policy.
Yeah, no, I hear that. In my reporting, I know you're from the civil rights community, and I've talked to a number of people in that community who are really worried about how poor kids, students of color, students in special education and English learners are going to fare under a Trump administration just because of some of the rhetoric they heard on the campaign trail. I know that those students have been really important to President Obama. It's something that he talks about a lot. Certainly something that we hear Secretary John King talk about a lot. From what you've seen, do you think that President-elect Trump shares their beliefs in educational equity?
So I think the country shares our beliefs in educational equity. The President and the First Lady have been focused on this from the very beginning. They are the beneficiaries of the fact that we make investments in our kids and in all kids. And they're very upfront about this, that they are the products of an educational system that, among other things, provided them support in getting to higher education and in being successful. And they are the first to say that they are where they are because of access to a quality education. And since the very first moment, they've been focused on making sure that's available to everyone in the country. That's our job. And it's not just our job because we are an altruistic and generous nation. It's our job because if our economy is going to be successful, we have to make sure that we are preparing people for college and career. So all of the big achievements, the fact that 49 states have now adopted standards that make sure that students are ready for college and career, the fact that again, that we're turning around the lowest performing schools, that we're having those kinds of successes, that we've connected 20 million more students to broadband in their classrooms. That's all aiming at the goal of making sure that we bring high quality education, that we make that available to every student. And importantly, the goals of accountability, the goals of supporting teachers, the goals of using metrics to measure ourselves, they've been hallmarks of our administration's work, but they're also enshrined in the Every Student Succeeds Act. Yeah. And again, that's a bipartisan piece of legislation. These are, and hopefully when we're at our best, the notion of making sure every kid in this country is successful is not the subject of partisan wrangling. How to get there? There's a debate about how to get there, and that debate, ultimately, we saw that debate in the legislative conversation over the Every Student Succeeds Act. Frankly, we're seeing that debate in the conversation over the regulations that we're putting forward on that act. But I don't think there is a debate on the goal.
So you mentioned broadband, and I know that was one of your initiatives to help connect rural America, in part, to the internet. You've had other initiatives for rural America, like career and technical education. But obviously, Mr. Trump did really well in those areas. So what more can be done for rural schools? What would you like to see the next administration do? Do you feel like you all did enough for those schools?
So in my role in domestic policy, one of the things that I help lead and staff is something called the Rural Council, where we actually have a bunch of federal agencies, including the Department of Education, working with the Department of Agriculture and focusing on what we call multi-generational strategies to support people in rural communities, meaning that we're not just focusing on the kids on one set of programs and on parents in another set of programs, but that we're actually focusing on what's happening in multiple generations. And that's actually been quite fruitful in making sure we're directing resources and that we're actually making progress. But some of our investments in things like innovation have really benefited rural communities. So there's, for example, through our I3 grants, a project focused on writing, which is supporting teachers in helping students be good critical thinkers and good writers. That's reaching tens of thousands of students and teachers in rural America. So again, we're making good on the notion that we have to reach every student in every corner of the country, and the investments that we're making in innovation are one of the ways that we do that. The investments that we're making in individualized learning, again, are among the tools that help us accomplish that.
So I've heard throughout Mr. Obama's presidency that education was one of his favorite issues. Can you tell me how involved does he get in kind of the wonky, weedsy details that we read about so often at Education Week?
He's really involved.
Yeah. Can you tell us a story that maybe something that we wouldn't know?
Yeah, this actually takes us into the higher education realm. So again, from the very first moment, he's been very deeply engaged. And our education works covers the whole span from early childhood education through K-12 and higher education. I became the domestic policy director in 2012, and he asked the team, he basically said, look, we're in a tough budget environment. I'm really focused on inequality and on kicking the doors of opportunity open. I want to know where we get the best bang for our buck in addressing opportunity and inequality. And the whole team spent months answering that question. Anything was on the table. And the answer we came back with was early childhood education. And it's from there that you get his proposal to make Pre-K, high-quality Pre-K available to every 4-year-old in this country. We figured out how to do it. We figured out how to pay for it. As a result of the work, while Congress didn't do what we would have liked them to do to get that done, we did make progress in 34 states. We've expanded the number of Pre-K slots. We've expanded the quality and the number of investments that are being made by states all over the country. The first place he went to after making that announcement was to Georgia, a red state, which had been really helping lead the charge. Oklahoma is another red state doing the same. So he puts these questions on the table. He immerses himself in the policy details. As you know, from his engagements on the issues, he's not only very immersed in the details, for him it's very personal. Again, because he understands that the impact that education had on his life and on the First Lady's life. And he's bound and determined, again, not just as a matter of altruism or equity, although those things are important, as a matter of economic necessity, right? The goal that he set for being the first in the world again in college attainment by 2020, that's because we don't function well in a global economy unless we accomplish that.
So one area where I saw the president's thinking evolve has to do with testing. So in the beginning of your administration, you all pushed teacher evaluation tied in part to test scores or growth in student learning. And by the end, I heard you all saying that you thought that there was too much testing. In fact, the president came out himself and said that in a Facebook video. Can you talk about how the administration's thinking evolved on that issue? Yeah, so it is an evolution in that we got more and more sophisticated in the tools that we're able to provide to make sure that testing is smarter. So it's not that we went from sort of being pro-testing to not testing. Like, you need assessments in order to make sure that you're making gains, making sure that you're closing disparities. But it is also true, both things can be true at the same time, that you need assessments in order to do your job properly, but that the system produces
too many of the wrong kinds of tests, that we know in lots of districts that there is duplicative testing, that there's too much testing which is filling in the bubble. And so we made investments in the kinds of tests which give the best information to teachers and parents and communities about what students know, what they're able to do, which lend themselves the least to sort of test prep instead of good teaching. So we made those kinds of investments because, again, we think smarter assessments are, the way to go to make sure that we're achieving our goals. But at the same time, we put forward a set of tools to make sure that we're supporting states in investing in auditing their testing, making sure that we're not doing too much of the wrong kind of thing, and in developing the kinds of assessments which really aid teaching and learning.
Okay. I just want to let everybody know that we will have an opportunity for Q&A. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but if you have questions for Cecilia, please line up over at the mic. One of the things that I saw you all do at the very beginning of the administration was pour tens of billions of dollars to save teachers' jobs during the recession.
Yes.
But state K-12 spending, it still hasn't really bounced up in many states back to those 2008 levels as you're leaving office. And we continue to expect a tight, at least federal budget environment for education, which you were talking about before. What has that meant for public schools?
Yeah, I think it's an enormous challenge. I mean, as you remember, when we came into office, we were in an economic free fall. The economy was shedding 700,000 jobs a month. And in the Recovery Act, we made, I think it was $60 billion of investments in schools. We protected or created about 400,000 teachers' jobs, which is not all of the jobs that were at stake. And in fact, state and local governments took the biggest hits economically, and that's where we shed a lot of jobs. But we made direct investments, particularly in making sure that we could keep teachers on the job. And those are important investments. But you're right, it's not just limited to K-12. States' investments in higher education are also not where they should be. And again, this is why it's important to put forward markers and to make sure that as we, as a country, implement this new K-12 law, as we continue to try to achieve our goals in higher education, making sure that it's affordable, making sure that students who go into debt are able to repay their debt that they're able to complete their educations and repay their debt, that we hold ourselves, that we hold our officials at the federal level, at the state level, at the district level, and for that matter, officials in schools and parents and communities accountable for results, which is why things like the civil rights data collection is really important. We learned, for example, that we were suspending 4-year-olds, which doesn't really make sense from a point of view of making sure that kids are successful, that they're able to graduate ready for college and career. We know a lot about what's happening with graduation rates. It's not just that they're going up in the aggregate, but in fact we are closing disparities. The groups that are making the most progress are the groups that had the furthest to go. That kind of information ultimately empowers communities to hold everybody accountable, and that's ultimately the fodder for the conversation we need to be having about investments at the state level as well as the federal level.
Okay, great, thank you. It looks like we do have a question. I have plenty more, but please.
So I'm a graduate student at American University, and I was curious to know, some of the other panelists have discussed this, but out of all of the initiatives and sort of progress that the Obama administration has had, what do you hope, or what do you foresee the Trump administration really focusing on? If there's any core issues that you really hope they'll continue, any work that they continue, if you have any like top 2 or anything like that.
Yeah, so I don't know what they're thinking. I don't have any more information really than anybody else does from what you see in the media. But we've been able to demonstrate in the last 8 years that change is possible, that progress is possible, and that it's possible in some of the places that sort of used to get written off as having intractable problems. So, and the best example of that is here in the District of Columbia, where because of assertively adopting reforms, the kinds of reforms that we've been talking about, and supporting teachers and using data to measure success, the District of Columbia is making greater strides than any other place in the country. And what that tells us is that progress is possible, that by applying these reforms, by being assertive about accountability, by being assertive about supporting teachers, by using data to measure our progress and being clear-eyed about what is and isn't going well, we can get to a place where we're educating every kid in this country successfully. And that, I think, is the most important thing. It's, I think, among the most important lessons of the last 8 years that I would hope that anybody, following us at any point in our trajectory forward would take heart in and continue to invest in, because we're making progress. And again, anybody, we expect to be held accountable for what we've produced. And again, I see a lot of trend lines going in the right direction. Anybody that follows needs to be measured against those standards. Our graduation rates continue to go up. Our disparities continuing to close. Are we continuing to reduce the number of dropout factories? All of those things are things that you have a right to ask us in this administration, and that we all have a right to ask of the next one.
Thank you. We have a question?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sharon Lynch. I'm a professor at George Washington University. You know, I think one of the things that I've liked most about President Obama, and I think your office has reflected it, as well as the Office of Science and Technology Policy, is sort of the nerdy, wonky aspects of the president's personality, and the fact that he really embraces science and STEM education and some of those things. I'm familiar with the movement for the next generation high schools and the very interesting education experiments that aren't necessarily charter schools, but could be, and charter school-like. So I guess looking forward, no, I'll say that differently. Looking toward the next administration, can you talk about how you might pass on some of those legacies that you've been able to accomplish? I mean, you mentioned broadband and some other kinds of science, STEM-y things that probably we need more of, I think, for everyone in the U.S.
Yeah, it's a great question, and you are right that this is an administration which honors its nerds. We're very proud of that. On broadband and on STEM in particular, and you know, because in part we have a Congress which hasn't been as active as we would have liked them to be, we've had to be creative about how we advance some of our initiatives. And so in STEM education, for example, the president set this very ambitious goal of 100,000 new teachers in STEM fields. Now, some of that we've been able to advance through the investments that we make at the federal government, but we also got, I think it's 280 different organizations involved in helping accomplish this goal. So that's everybody from school systems themselves to philanthropies to corporations. We've been tackling every partner we can find to both understand the importance of achieving this goal, but also to roll up their sleeves and be part of achieving that goal. And so we are hopeful that we're on track to achieve that goal in both producing more teachers and hopefully creating the kinds of career paths that support and sustain those teachers over time. And so we've demonstrated, again, that it's possible to make progress through additional sets of tools, through building partnerships. So government has a lot to say and do in order to make these things happen. But it's also true that we're more effective when we are engaging others in the campaign, in the effort. That helps, frankly, expand the buy-in, the fact that there's a wide range of folks working on expanding STEM education, the number of teachers, in the movement for computer science for all, which is something that the president put forward, or free community college. There are movements around all of these things that we have helped create. That's also true of early childhood education. And this notion that we can all be kind of rowing in the same direction and that everybody has a role to play in getting there and a stake in the results, I think is something that we've accomplished and demonstrated that can absolutely and should absolutely continue.
Looks like we have another question.
Hello, I'm Bobby Pedrick, Director of Special Education from a large school system nearby. I am a lifelong advocate for all struggling students to meet with the greatest success they can and to encourage the staff working with them to challenge our students more than we have historically. I'm wondering, two questions, two perspectives. One is, as we move forward, any hope you can offer? And then also, as your team developed work over the past and supported laws, what thought processes you had regarding the fact that we in this country expect 98% or more of our students to perform at the same exact level in the exact same or similar timelines. So I watch students every day who, in their classrooms, both disabled English language learners and just simply students who struggle. I watch them be successful with supports and services.
Right.
And then, as a culminating event, one time a year, they're tested without those supports, and they fail. And then they come back next year and do the same thing. And then we do, different states do different things, bridge projects or such, to get them to the point of graduation. So in a country where we expect, where we philosophically say we believe in differentiation, and yet one time a year everyone is judged on the same plane.
Yeah.
What hope do you have for those students? What can we do? And what was the thought process behind NCLB and other legislature that got us to this place?
Yeah. So you're right that the pendulum swung too far in one direction, and actually my colleague Roberto Rodriguez and I were both part of the effort that, that passed NCLB when we were both at a civil rights organization. The poor man has had to work for me twice in two different institutions. The balance that we were trying to strike in the policies and the way that we implement them is somewhere other than what you're describing, where everybody's held to the same standard and not necessarily given the supports they need to achieve as they are capable. And the other end of the spectrum, which is where we were, which is that certain groups of students and students with disabilities and English language learners were very much among them, and very frequently students with last names like mine, because we were thought all to be English language learners, were left completely out of accountability systems because the assumption was that we couldn't achieve. And as a result, the energy and resources and expertise that went into teaching and expecting success dissipated. And so we were trying to get to a place where school systems were being held accountable for results for those kids. So it is possible, and frankly, it is essential to make sure that we're doing that well. That's part of what smart and thoughtful assessments are about. And it's also what making sure that we're putting forward the resources to provide the kinds of services and supports that students need. That's what that's about. So we don't want to go back to a place where we have entire school systems essentially ignoring huge groups of kids because the assumption is it's too hard to assess them and maybe they can't achieve. But we also have to strike a balance between making sure we have expectations for our kids and making sure we're providing the means and the supports for teachers, for school leaders, and for the students themselves to make sure that they can get where we need them to be. But going back to not including them at all is not an acceptable option.
So I'm going to ask, and it looks like we don't have any more audience questions, so I'm going to take moderator's prerogative to ask one last question.
Sure.
And then I want to thank Cecilia and all of you for joining us. What would you say, if you had to pick one thing, is the president's greatest accomplishment on education, and what would you bet, or what have you heard from him, is his biggest regret?
Wow. It's hard to pick one thing. I am fiercely proud of a great deal that we've done. But again, going back to something that I already said, this, especially now, I think it is really vital to demonstrate to people in this country that change is possible and achievable and measurable. And we've done that in education, in the K-12 system. Actually, we're doing it, and we've made enormous progress actually in higher education. I mean, I recognize that it's less the subject of today, but the fact that we have 5 million student borrowers enrolled in pay-as-you-earn programs that are not paying only 10% of their income in order to pay back their student loans, which makes their debt affordable and helps them advance their careers. There's a whole array of innovations in the higher ed space that I'm very proud of, that the president, it was another one of those, he rolled up his sleeves and got into the weeds of the policymaking and kept bringing it up. I'm proud of those achievements, although there is much more to do. But in the K-12 system, again, we've demonstrated, we accomplished reforms in the sense that 49 states have college and career ready standards now. If anyone would have said at the beginning, we're going to get to a point where nearly every state has high standards, people would have thought that was crazily and maybe unnecessarily ambitious. And we got there because we put forward incentives that helped states get there, and also created the sense of flexibility that helped the states get there in their own way. And we ended up passing bipartisan legislation which further enshrined the notion that states need to be helping their students succeed to college and career-ready standards in a way which gives states flexibility. That is no small achievement, and ultimately is going to pay enormous dividends for our students and for our country economically over time. But most important, the notion that, in school systems that have struggles, in neighborhoods that have schools where students aren't achieving, that is not inevitable. These are not intractable problems without solutions, that all of this is something that we can address, and we know how to do it, and we know how to measure it, and we can point to places where it's happening. Perhaps that's the greatest accomplishment, because that then lays the groundwork for further change. The president likes to say that you don't reach the full transformation that you seek in 8 years. Nobody can. But you do the best you can to show the way, to demonstrate the progress, to demonstrate what works, and then you pass the baton. And ultimately, especially the way that the new law is structured, it's up to us, not government officials, but the citizenry, to make sure that we continue to make progress, to use the tools that are available in the law to hold everybody accountable at every level. That's how the system is designed to work. But at the end of the day, that's in our hands.
So biggest regret, the second part of the question.
Well, so you took the moderator's prerogative. I'll take the policy advisor's prerogative because I work on a variety of issues.
Yeah.
And my area of expertise is immigration policy.
Yeah.
It relates to our education system because
Absolutely.
so many of our kids are in
It
immigrant
definitely
families.
does, for sure, yeah.
We hoped very much to pass an immigration reform.
Yeah.
We could see the finish line
Yeah.
in 2013.
Yeah.
And it didn't happen. And as a result, we have students in our schools living in fear of their own removal or their parents' removal.
Yeah.
U.S. citizen kids in fear of their parents' removal. And it's pretty hard to be a successful learner with that kind of fear. And I know for a fact that the president greatly regrets that we and the Congress were unable together to get that done.
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you so much
Thank
for your
you,
time.
and thanks
I
for
really
your
appreciate
patience.
it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for your patience. And we really appreciated you coming today. It looks like
I thought that leap deserved an applause. I did so well. Thank you so much for your time today and being such troopers. And for those on the live stream, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a terrific opportunity to learn and to find out much of the news and information that Education Week shares every day, but in a live setting. So glad, and we hope you'll be with us again. We plan on doing more of these and hope to bring at least 3 more of these to you within the next calendar year. See you in 2017.